This is a really good question. And this is something I feel like a lot of people kind of struggle with here. So the question is from Natalie. Natalie asks, my dog recently completed a board and train. My question is that I'm finding he is so dramatic receiving corrections with the e-collar to the point that if we are in public, I am hesitant to correct as so people don't think I am stabbing him. Do I just need to get over it? He's doing great, just still trying to work through structured walks when my husband and I and the other dogs all walk together. The same goes when people come to the house. He barks at them, and if I correct, he twirls around like I punched him. He's always being dramatic, even on a 7 at times. I feel like I am not being consistent and causing confusion. Thanks. Love the show. This is a good question. Okay, so we get asked this a lot. And basically the moral of this story is dogs that are dramatic about getting corrected, how do we handle that when it comes to the general perception of the public, right? Which is something everybody needs to be aware of. Let's first caveat this by saying nobody, like there are dogs out there that will literally act like you're murdering them over anything you do, right? It has nothing to do with the e-collar in this case, right? It has nothing to do with a prong collar. I've seen dogs on a flat leash or a slip collar or anything like that. When they feel tension on their neck, just start screaming and flailing and just making a huge scene, right? So we got to look at 1, what causes this? 2, how do we work through it? And 3, how do we handle it when we're in public, right? So I think as far as the cause of this, when we see a lot of it, has to do with 2 things. 1, the already high arousal state that the dog is already in, right? 2, the general sensitivity the dog may actually have. And 3, to some extent, the dog knowing they can kind of play the owner with some of this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So you got to look at each one of those things. First and foremost, the arousal, right? We have to be aware of the fact that when our dog is in a high state of arousal, they are going to be much more vocal than they are in a lower state of arousal, right? So as the dog gets amped up, like I'll take Vinny as an example, right? When he gets hyped up because we're going to throw a ball or we're going for a walk or whatever it may be, if you just touch him wrong, he's so on edge and geared up and stuff like that, that energy has to come out somewhere, right? And for some dogs, that's typically in a display of moving really quick or running or jumping or getting zoomies or anything like that. For dogs that are under control that have that arousal, it will come out as vocalization, right? That vocalization has nothing to do with it hurting them. She even said in this post, even at a 4 or a 7 or whatever it was, which is literally lower than a human even perceives, right? It's so unbelievably low. But because it catches the dog off guard, it's like it just kind of, they're like right here, and it's like, you know, it lets out just that little extra bit of energy, right? And it's something that displays itself as if we're killing the dog, right? Sometimes. So how do we work through the high arousal situation? 1, we teach them to control that impulse better, right? So as we get further along in the training, and as we get better control of the dog in these scenarios, the arousal level typically will come down a little bit. And yeah, in some of those cases, you got to kind of fight through it. Now, obviously in public, that's different. We're going to get into that in a minute here. There's kind of a couple variables to this, but first we have to understand, obviously, where it's coming from. The second one is dogs that are either extremely hypersensitive in general, right? Or dogs that it's catching them off guard and it's startling them, right? So the hypersensitivity, we do see dogs that are very, very sensitive. They work pretty low, right? The positive about this is if a dog is hypersensitive, that means that we should be able to stop these behaviors much easier, right? So let's take the case of we're out on a walk and the dog is now holding a down stay, right? We put the dog in a down, they get up from it, we tell them no, we correct them, and then we put them back into it, right? If we're saying the dog actually is as sensitive as they're making it seem based on their vocalization and stuff like that, that would mean that they care about that correction a lot, and that would mean that they would alter their behavior very quickly, right? Most dogs that I see are not that, right? Because they'll vocalize and they'll make a big scene, but they still won't maintain their position. right? Which means they obviously didn't care that much about the correction, which means it's probably the latter reason why they're doing it in the first place, which is the hyperarousal, which again, we talked about addressing that, and we'll talk about working through that, right? The last case is the dogs that sometimes kind of play their owner a little bit, right? And this one we see quite a bit, and I'll give you a couple examples of it here, right? The best example of it is I'll see owners time and time again that are, say, doing one-on-one sessions, right? They come into our facility. The dog is doing okay, but still clearly kind of wound up and pushing boundaries a little bit and stuff like that. And the owner will be correcting them on, let's say, a 20 right out of 100. Let's say 20 out of 100 they're trying to correct them at. And the dog's kind of making a scene every time they correct them and yelping and yipping and this and that and whatever, right? But they're still not getting past that hurdle, right? But they're like, they care about it. Look, they're yelping every time we hit it. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let's go take the dog for a walk, or let's go work on this, or whatever it may be. And immediately I take that remote from them and I'm working the dog and I'm going up on the level. And I wind up at, say, again, let's pull a number out of our ass here, an 80 out of 100, right? And, you know, the dog immediately settles down. They're focused back into position. And the owner's like, look, he's so good with you. I don't understand why he does this with me. And then I'm like, hey, do you want to know what level I'm at right now? Because I don't tell them typically initially. And they're like, what? Oh, I'm at an 80. And they're every time it's like, what? Mind blown.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, what? But he's not making any noise. He's responding at a normal way to that level. What's going on there? I believe that a lot of these dogs are somewhat conscious of when they're in that hyped up, aroused state of mind, when they start vocalizing and kind of making a scene and stuff like that. Typically, mom and dad stop doing whatever it is that they're doing, right? Now, listen, we can't get inside of the dog's head and ask them if that's what they're consciously doing, obviously.
Yeah.
But I do think that they understand the cause and effect of things and understand that making a scene or throwing a quote-unquote tantrum typically works in their favor.
Yep.
Right? So what do I encourage those people to do? I typically say if they're used to working the dog at a 20 or 30, and we wind up in the session every single time they come in winding up at a 70 or 80, I tell them, okay, cool, for the next 2 to 3 days, start with your e-collar at that 70 or 80 and just tough through the first 3 or 4 corrections that you need to give the dog and see what happens. And 9 out of 10 times, we find that the dog immediately starts getting better for them. With whatever it is that they're working on, the dog gets significantly more compliant and they get way less vocal about it.
Dang.
All right, catch my breath for a minute. So that's what I see typically with a lot of this kind of stuff, is those are kind of the reasons why these dogs typically do these things, right? Now, let's say that it's the arousal issue, right? And it's not the like dog kind of playing the owner kind of issue or the hypersensitivity issue, right? What do we do then, right? Because there are definitely going to be dogs out there that are just dramatic about corrections no matter what, right? And particularly this dog she's talking about is a German Shepherd. German Shepherds are notoriously extremely vocal dogs. Another example, Krista's dog, Doof, right? I've literally, forget the e-collar for a second.
Yeah.
I've watched Doof run and play with other dogs and like brush against the wall while he's playing with a dog and then just start screaming like literally like somebody is stabbing him, like she said.
I was literally going to use him as an example earlier. I was like Doof?
Yeah. And nobody's killing him, right? Doof loves life, right? But he also loves to be a huge drama queen about stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So listen, that happens sometimes. So what do we do about dogs like that, right? First and foremost, I always say we need to isolate the specific situations the dog is giving us a hard time in. And we need to work on those things in more controlled settings first, right? So let's use the example that Natalie said, right? She said, trying to work through structured walks when my husband and I and our other dog all walk together, right? That is a situation where what I'm assuming is happening is all of the 4 of them are going and they're trying to go to some sort of populated area and it's not going well. and they're needing to resort to trying to correct high, but they don't want to do it because he's making a scene and it turns into a mess, right? At some point, you have to address it, right? We have to correct for it. We have to make sure the consequences are motivating enough, and we have to get past the problem. But you can't really do that if you're out in public, and there's all sorts of people around that don't know the context of what you're doing. They don't know that your dog's a drama queen and that you're not killing them, and you're just going to look like somebody that's just abusing your dog,
abusing your animal.
You know what I mean? Then you wind up on the news because somebody takes some sort of sneaky video of you, and it turns into a goddamn mess. Right? So what do we do in that situation? We work on it in quiet, controlled settings, right? Find a quiet park to work on that scenario in, and pick something easier to address and get some success with, right? So if he has a problem with your husband and your other dog walking around, go to a park, put him into a downstay, preset your level really high, and have your husband walk the other dog around and just work on that single thing, right? Correct him every time he breaks it, right? And get past that hurdle first before you go to put it into a public type setting. Right? Then when you go into the public type setting, if you've already done your work and working through it, one of two things will happen. One, the dog will remember and just be pretty good in general. And if you do need to give a correction, it's only 1 or 2 at a high level when you get past the issue fairly quick. Or 2, because you've worked through it at a high level so many times in the less public settings, you could work a little bit lower in the public settings, right? And the dog won't be quite as dramatic because the arousal level will be lower at that point, right? Same deal with people coming into the house. Simulate that one, because I think that was an example also of he barks and does this and does that when people come over to the house. One of the first things that I tell people when they're working through issues with guests coming over is you have to perfect it with you and your spouse first, or you and your significant other, whatever, you know? So, cool. Your husband's out grocery shopping or whatever, right? Before he gets home, hey, I'm going to be home in 5 minutes. Boom. Prepare yourself, level set high, shadow bed, go let him in, high level correction if he breaks it, take him back to it, let him in, and perfect it in that scenario first. Because here's the thing, typically we are the biggest distraction for our dog, right? So if we could work through it in that setting, it makes it 9,000 times easier when somebody else comes over, right? So you could work through it in that situation. And then in general, with my dogs, when I am home at my house, not in public, in a private setting, I am 9 times more on top of my dogs over shit than I am when I'm out in public, to leverage those opportunities of being able to give big corrections for things so that I don't have to be as hard on them in public, so that they're just good. Right? So if I work twice as high on the e-collar as I typically would when I'm at my house to make sure those consequences are as motivating as possible, then I could work way lower when I'm out in public, and they're going to know that if they don't respond to those lower ones, it still will go up at some point, right? So it's all about leverage, and it's all about just knowing how to work these scenarios and preparing your dog for them, right? And I find that that's one of the biggest things to do is you got to prepare your dog for these situations and get past them. Now, one last point, just because in the part about having people come over, it was mentioned that the dog will bark and do these other types of things and stuff like that. Also, keep in mind, there are vocal dogs out there, and nothing you do will make that go away. Right? Vinny's gotten significantly better with it over time. I mean, you saw when he came in today and he was in a downstay, like he didn't really make any noise or anything. But he used to be the dog that if I would have people come over, I would put him on the bed and he would hold that bed stay. He'd have no problem with that. But he would be sitting there chirping or yipping or barking or whatever the whole time he was on that bed, just because he was so hyped up and that arousal needed to come out somewhere, right? The biggest thing to keep in mind is you have to look past that, and you have to look at what is the expectation in this moment. With guests coming over, it's just holding the bed stay. So you can't be trying to correct for that barking. You can't be trying to correct for all this other stuff. Same deal with out in public. Vinny used to have these perceived notions that when we would go to fields, we would be training for Mondio, because that's what we used to do, right? And we would do high arousal training in fields. So he was really bad for a little bit about, if we were walking and he saw a big open field, he would start getting jacked up, right? And same deal, barking, yipping, all this, all that. And you can't correct for that. It's a weird state of mind that they're not even super conscious of. So you have to work through it just through the physical things that the dog is doing, right? So in his case, Are you maintaining your heel? Are you maintaining your down? From there, I can't really get mad at you if you're vocalizing, right? So by isolating those corrections you're giving and making sure that they're only for very specific things, you can make it way, way easier on yourself.
Yeah.
So those would be my recommendations, is understanding why the dog is doing it, leveraging all of the situations and preparing the dog for the big scenarios so it's easier. And then the third part would be understanding and learning to look through the vocalization that your dog is making, even outside of giving corrections, and just focus on the physical things you're asking.
Yeah. Wow. That was a lot of information right there.
Yeah.
I think that was a really good point. Because people want their dog to be that perfect picture, you know? And so they will correct for that maybe excessive barking.
Yes.
So now you're just really, basically what you're saying is you're kind of confusing the dog at that point, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. And that was the big thing, too, what she had said, where she feels like she's not being consistent and causing confusion, which will happen, right?
Yeah.
If you start not correcting because you're scared of the responses your dogs are going to have, you will create more confusion, which is why you need to be strategic about this stuff and understand where you're working through it and how you're working through it.
Yeah.
You know? Sometimes it's not appropriate. I tell people that leave our board and train, it's not appropriate to go right from picking your dog up to the most distracting environment, like Edgewater or the pet store, things like that, because you're not prepared for it, and you're going to cause more confusion by not being prepared for it and not knowing how to work through it, you know?
Yeah.
So that same deal will happen with this stuff.
Yeah. Well, and that's where you made another great point, was the working harder at the home, you know? Because I never even thought about that. I mean, yeah, getting it more of that harder, tougher corrections, I guess, at home where you're not in public, because like you said, I mean, there's that like feeling of being embarrassed or anything like that, or worrying about people filming or what they're thinking. So you can have more peace of mind when you're out if you're getting that stuff, the harder corrections done at home.
Yeah, I mean, training starts in the house, right? And the problem is, in our house, you know, only 23 hours out of the day, you're not really asking your dog to do things. So when you do find places to work things with your dogs or give them consequences for things in the house, if you get it super under control there in the setting where they're going to be real loosey-goosey and doing whatever they want and stuff, they're going to start to realize, wow, like, you know, even when nobody's around, they're on my case. So I better, you know, keep it together when I go out.
Yeah.
So you got to be aware of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And then, so I think this is a good example just because people can go watch these on the Miracle YouTube.
Yeah.
You remember Mochi?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just
the miracle of Mochi.
Yes, the miracle of Mochi.
Berkelhagen Photography. Check them out.
Yes. But Mochi is one that we did a lot of YouTube videos on, you know, probably 2 years ago at this point. So what would you say as an analysis for people that can go watch that? What was Mochi's reasoning for being how he was?
Yeah. So first off, he's a Shiba Inu, right? And Shibas notoriously do the quote-unquote Shiba scream, right? Which basically means anytime that they're protesting something, they make this like blood-curdling, disgusting, horrendous noise that until you've witnessed it, you don't think is real, right? It's like one of the most horrible noises in the world.
It was awful.
And it's just protest, right? But it does sound like you're killing him, right?
Yeah.
Even though you're not doing anything to him. And that's the big thing to keep in mind with this, is when we start talking about dogs vocalizing and being drama queens and stuff like that, I think a lot of people can get it in their head like we're hurting them, and that's why they're doing it.
Yeah.
90% of the time, that is not the case. 99% of the time, that is not the case, right? They're being dramatic, and it's arousal that's coming out, or it's protest, right?
Yep.
So in Mochi's case, you'll see that we had to look past all of that protest he was doing. We didn't really correct for it a whole lot. We just showed him that the things he was protesting did not work, right? So doing nails, handling him, brushing him, putting a muzzle on, all that kind of stuff. We just had to do it over and over and over again in a private setting. So people didn't think we were killing him until he started to get past that. And then we were able to take him out and about, and it wasn't a big deal. But I know even like we had to be conscious of, like, I couldn't work him if we had like clients in the building doing lessons and stuff, because they would literally think we were murdering a dog, even though we weren't, right? I cannot emphasize it enough. We didn't do anything to him, right? But that's just what he did. And that's why he came to us. So you got to be aware of that kind of stuff. You got to be strategic about it as you're working through it. But that's a very good example. Yeah, check out the Miracle of Mochi. It's a video on our YouTube channel. You could see all about that.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Yeah, for sure.